Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Jennifer Windsor, and I'm currently the Associate Dean at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I see many familiar faces in the audience. Prior to that, I spent 10 years as Executive Director at Freedom House. When Michelle asked me to moderate this panel, I was very excited because it's been about 3 months since I've been ensconced in the ivory tower. And I know that lots of things have happened in the real world, and I hope they're happening in Egypt in a positive way. So I look forward to hearing about that. We've got two individuals, our speakers. There aren't two more qualified people I can think of to address where Egypt is going. We've got parliamentary elections coming up at the end of the month. Michelle Dunn is someone that combines both having the insights of being in the government at one point in her career, as well as being able to step back and look at issues from a perspective in the Carnegie. And I've found her writing to be always, and her points to be always on the mark, not gently and diplomatically put, but directly. So I look forward to hearing Michelle tell us what's really going on. And then we have someone, of course, that needs no introduction, Amr Hamzari, who's the research director and senior associate in Beirut. There you are. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So he's written a number of books, and since he's now closer to Cairo than all of us, you can also probably tell us more what's going on. So let me turn it over first to Michelle. What we're going to try to do is have opening remarks by Michelle and then Amr, and then I will be asking a few opening questions while those of you who are shy and not sure about what you want to ask can write yours down, and we're going to get to some audience discussion as fast as we can. So, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. I think the way that we're going to arrange this is I'm going to speak a little bit about the elections, how they're going to be run, the mechanics of that, and maybe just a few words on U.S. policy toward the Egyptian elections. And then Amr is going to speak a little bit more about the politics of the elections. The parties, the candidates, who's running, what their platforms are, and that kind of stuff. Is that right, Mazbout, Amr? Yeah. Okay. Look, I just want to. There's so much we could potentially talk about. This is a very interesting political time in Egypt, with parliamentary elections on November 28th. And then a presidential election next fall at some time. The date of that has not been announced. I'm going to try to talk about just a few brief topics. One of them is how the elections will be run and in what ways they will be similar and different to Egypt's last parliamentary elections in 2005. The second thing is sort of what to watch for, I think, in the 10 days between now and the elections. What kind of developments I'm sort of waiting to see. The implications for next year's presidential election, what the results of the parliamentary elections will mean, and then a few words on U.S. policy. Now, this year's parliamentary elections, will be similar to the 2005 elections in some ways. They will be similar in the sense that there will be many, many candidates running for many seats, and I know Ahmed will have a lot more to say about that, about the plethora of candidates, in a parliament that still has relatively little weight within the Egyptian political system. The Egyptian political system is still one in which the executive branch and the presidency hold most of the power. As in the case with 2005, the main political players are the same: the National Democratic Party, the NDP, the Muslim Brotherhood. There are smaller parties running as well, the WEFT and other parties, and a lot of independent candidates. It's also similar to 2005 in the sense that there will be no international observers or monitors at these elections, and it's unclear to what extent there will be effective monitoring by Egyptian civil society groups. I'll return to that point in a minute. But there are a lot of differences between now and the last elections 5 years ago. There are a lot more seats. There are 508 seats this year being elected, plus 10 to be appointed. That's 64 more than 5 years ago, and that's because of the addition of a quota for women. 12% of the new parliament, these are seats specifically for which only female candidates may run. So that has increased the size of the parliament quite a bit. There will be, all of the elections this year will take place on one day. If you recall, in 2005, they were spread over three different days, and that led to a pretty messy situation in ways. But this year, it's all going to happen on one day. The reason why it all has to happen, why it can all happen on one day, is because of some changes to the electoral system. There were a series of constitutional amendments in 2007, and some laws then passed based on those amendments. And this has changed the whole system of supervising elections in Egypt. The reason that Egypt had to hold parliamentary elections over 3 days in 2005 was that there was court-mandated full judicial supervision of elections. That meant there had to be a sitting judge in every polling place, supervising every ballot box. The 2007 constitutional amendments undid that. There's still a certain degree of judicial supervision, but it's not full judicial supervision. In 2005, Egypt didn't have enough judges to have a judge in every polling place. There are something like 50,000 polling places typically for parliamentary elections in Egypt, and Egypt doesn't have that many judges. But this year, they're not going to have a judge in every polling place. There will be judges supervising the counting. And Egypt now, instead of judicial supervision, it has an electoral commission. And the members of the Electoral Commission, about half of them are sitting members of the judiciary. So there are also some retired judges on it. But there's a lot of concern in Egypt that the Electoral Commission is not fully independent of the government, and that the fact that there's not a judge in every polling place is going to mean less transparency in the elections. The judges really did serve, to a certain extent, as whistleblowers in 2005 for things that they saw going wrong in the polling places, which may be why they won't be there this time. The other thing that's different from 2005 is that I think it is a less permissive campaigning environment for candidates in the elections this year, particularly for the Muslim Brotherhood. As I'm sure you're aware, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a party, it's a banned organization. It runs candidates in the elections as independents. But normally they openly declare that they're affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and they use the Muslim Brotherhood slogan. And the Muslim Brotherhood slogan, Islam is the solution, has basically been specifically banned in this election, again, based on these 2007 constitutional amendments, one of which outlawed any political activity with a religious point of reference. And we actually are seeing, I believe there have been something like 130-something Muslim Brotherhood activists arrested just within the past couple of days for using the slogan, Islam is the solution. So this is kind of becoming a running battle. And I'm sure Ahmed will have a lot more to say about the Brotherhood in the election. So there are 10 days now between today and the Egyptian elections. Let me say a few things about, I think, what to watch for in the next week or so, and then what to watch for on election day itself. One of the issues in the next week or so really is that a number of candidates, particularly Muslim Brotherhood candidates, were disqualified. The Muslim Brotherhood wanted to run about 134 or so candidates for the 508 seats, so they were only seeking to run for about a quarter of the seats in the parliament, and a number of those have been disqualified. I think the Brotherhood is still trying to fight this, but I'm not really sure how much more time they have. But that's an issue that has already caused it caused very large demonstrations by the Brotherhood in the city of Alexandria a few days ago, and this is a troublesome issue about, which candidates, opposition candidates in particular, are going to be able to run. Another big issue is whether or not I already mentioned the campaigning issue. Okay, whether the opposition candidates in particular will be able to hold rallies and political gatherings and so forth. We will see. Egypt, we're just in the first couple of days of the electoral campaign, and we'll see whether candidates in particular, opposition and in particular Muslim Brotherhood candidates, will be able to campaign. As I said, we're already seeing some arrests. A major issue, I think, is whether or not the Electoral Commission is going to truly facilitate the work of Egyptian civil society monitors in this election. The government has steadfastly resisted calls for international observers in these elections. Members of the government and the leadership of the National Human Rights Council and the Electoral Commission have said repeatedly that they view this as an infringement on Egyptian sovereignty, and that only undeveloped countries who can't run their own elections have observers, all of which is not true, of course. International observers are invited by many countries around the world, including the United States and many other well-established democracies. But at any rate, this is the argument that's being used in Egypt. And so the question, and they keep saying that, well, we're going to have Egyptian monitors, and the question is, will they really facilitate the work of monitors? There are a very large number of people who have been trained by civil society organizations. Over 10,000, well over 10,000 people have been trained to monitor these elections, and many of them, thousands and thousands of them, have gone ahead and applied. There are established procedures now through the Electoral Commission and the National Council on Human Rights for monitors to try to get credentialed. The question is, will they be credentialed? What has happened in the past is that the Electoral Commission has credentialed a very small number of monitors, 10% or less than that, of those who have applied. And also there's been a problem with not getting the word out to those who are running the polling places to let the monitors in, to let them inside. They've often had to sort of sit outside the polling places, which is not really monitoring. So there are now established procedures, and it's going to be a major effort, right, to issue credentials to 10,000 plus domestic monitors, and to get the word, and to do it in enough time. That's also been another thing that's happened in the past, to issue some credentials literally on the eve of elections, when Egypt is a large country and these monitors need to travel out to a lot of different places. So will they issue credentials? Will they issue them in time? Will they get the word out, and will the poll workers actually let them in and actually let them observe all the voting and the counting? Those are all very big questions, and that's all going to, if it's going to happen at all, it's going to happen over the next week. Okay, so we'll know by a week from now whether these domestic monitors are going to get in or not. Now, on the election day itself, one of the major issues in the past has been violence, different kinds of violence. Some of this has been violence by security forces, forming cordons around polling places where there were particularly sensitive races, a candidate that the ruling party really didn't, that was facing a lot of competition, and the ruling party really didn't want that candidate to lose. They've sometimes surrounded polling places and just kept the voters out. And this has led to violence, with voters trying to force their way in and security forces keeping them out and that kind of thing. That was a major issue, particularly in the final of the 3 rounds of the 2005 elections. There's also typically in elections a lot of activity by thugs who are working, not uniformed security, but people without uniforms, working either for the security services or for specific candidates, who intimidating or coercing voters or keeping them out if they're not believed to be supporting the candidate that the thug is working for. And there's a possibility also of violence between thugs who are working for different candidates. This has definitely happened in previous elections. I think that Alexandria is emerging as a particular hot spot there. There are some very hot races. A lot of the Brotherhood candidates in Alexandria were disqualified, and there's just been a lot of there's been some recent unrest in Alexandria due to some very high-profile cases of police brutality, not directly related to these elections, but and also the Brotherhood has a strong presence in Alexandria. So I'm just saying that that could be a place where we could see particular trouble on Election Day, although it's hard to predict, not necessarily the only place. We'll be waiting to see on Election Day, do the monitors, the domestic civil society monitors, as well as the representatives of candidates. Candidates are allowed to send representatives, and the media, do all of these people get access to the polling places? The Higher Election Committee has on its website the rules and regulations for giving these people access to the polling places. It'll be interesting to see whether it actually happens. And then, of course, we'll be looking out on Election Day for reports from the monitors of the usual kind of irregularities that we would see happen. I mean, aside from violence, things like ballot box stuffing, diversion of ballot boxes before they get counted, things like that, the typical things that one looks for in an election. Briefly on next year's presidential election and the implications. It'll be interesting to see whether there are any precedents set in these parliamentary elections that then would need to be followed in the presidential election next year. For example, if domestic monitors are given full access, this for the parliamentary elections, then I think it would be hard to argue that they shouldn't be for next year's presidential election. And in fact, this might be why the Egyptian government has resisted establishing the precedent of allowing international observers in now, because they wouldn't be necessarily wanting to have them the next time around. Also, according to the Egyptian constitution, the People's Assembly that will now be elected has some sway over who can run in the presidential election next year, because only political parties that have a presence in Parliament can put forward a candidate. There are other rules as well. The political party has to be fully licensed and has to have been established for at least 5 years. But if they don't win any seats, if they don't have any seats in either House of Parliament, then a party can't put a presidential candidate on the ballot. Of course, there's also a mechanism for getting an independent, non-party candidate on the presidential ballot. It sets a very high threshold of getting a lot of endorsements from the People's Assembly and other elected assemblies, which typically are dominated by the National Democratic Party. So I don't expect any big surprises in that regard. But however this People's Assembly turns out will say something about who can run in next year's presidential election. On U.S. policy. So earlier this week, the State Department put out the fullest articulation to date of what it is exactly that the United States has been raising with the government of Egypt privately and pushing for a bit in these elections. Free campaigning, civil society, get out the vote activity, media coverage, all of that before the elections, and an open electoral process on Election Day itself with domestic monitoring and international observers. The U.S. is continuing to raise that. And what we saw today was a pretty strong reaction from the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, rejecting outside interference, and I would say in harsher than usual tones, rejecting specifically American attempts to say something about internal Egyptian politics. I would say that the statement shows that the message has been received. The Egyptian government was kind of ignoring what the U.S. was saying for a long time. Now they felt that they have to respond to it. They may or may not respond to it in a constructive way, in other words, by responding constructively to any of the things that the U.S. has been raising. But I think the harshness of the response today shows that there's a sense of pressure being felt. whether, just from my own point of view about U.S. policy on this, whether there is any constructive Egyptian government response to what the U.S. has been raising or not, I think it's important that the U.S. has done this and that the U.S. continues to do it for longer-term reasons. It's important for the U.S. to make clear where it stands on these issues. We might or might not see much change on these issues during the presidency of President Mubarak. But I would note that I think the next president of Egypt, and we have no idea who he is, but whoever he is, he's already on the scene and he's already listening. And these messages will be getting through to that person as well. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Amr?
Okay. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to join you. I hope you can hear me well. Okay, let me add to Michelle's excellent points on explaining the mechanics of the parliamentary elections in Egypt. Let me add a couple of aspects, points to highlight the politics of the elections, which we will be having, as Michelle mentioned, in 10 days from today. And I'm going to try to use the same approach which Michelle used, trying to highlight the differences in the politics of the elections between 2005 and 2010. And let me start by telling you that this time we are looking at in 2010 we are looking at a political calendar in Egypt which is difficult not only for opposition actors to find strategies and ways to participate, but we are looking at a political calendar which contains parliamentary elections on November 28, 2010, and contains in less than 12 months presidential election. And this is quite an important factor to keep in mind from a regime point of view, from a government perspective, because it's very difficult to imagine that the Egyptian regime will be happy to see the parliamentary elections and the presidential elections ending with a bad reputation. Ending with a reputation of the two elections, parliamentary and presidential, being rigged, or having suffered from a series of violations, be it with regard to observation, with regard to opposition participation. This time, the government is trying to manage the election scene in a way which does not create much headache for the government later when it gets to the presidential elections. It's very difficult for the Egyptian government, which has been putting forward reform credentials, which has been talking much about reform and democratic reform throughout the last years. It's very difficult for the government to see the two elections in less than 12 months having produced a bad reputation, a bad image for Egypt. So they are quite managing the scene in a way which is different from what they did in 2005. Michelle mentioned the issue of judicial supervision, and there are some other issues which I'm going to highlight in a minute. But so the first point which we have to keep in mind is the difference between 2005. In 2005, the presidential elections took place before the parliamentary elections. Mubarak was re-elected, and then we had parliamentary elections. This time it's the other way around, and it makes the parliamentary elections quite significant, be it from an opposition or from a government point of view. The second point, in comparing 2005 and 2010, and here specifically to the parliamentary elections, and unlike 2005, where government and opposition were keen on participation, where participation was the only game in town, where no one raised or tried to contest whether participation makes sense or not. This time we are looking at a highly divided scene, especially within the opposition spectrum. It's not true that it's not true that all opposition forces are participating. We have some major forces, parties and otherwise, parties and the Muslim Brotherhood, which decided to participate. But their decisions to participate were highly contested internally. I'll get back to that as well. And we have a bloc within the opposition spectrum in Egypt composed of parties such as Al-Ghad of Ayman Noor, the Democratic Front of Osama al-Ghazali Harb, some informal opposition actors like the National Association for Change of Al-Barad'i, and young activists who went in a different direction, in the opposite direction, who called for a boycott, who put forward demands to boycott the elections. And basically, if you look at their demands, they have been trying to say two things to the Egyptian public opinion. One, participation is not paying off because Egypt has not been moving gradually into a better populated political space or more of a democratic polity. And participation is not paying off because the NDP continues to dominate the parliament, be it the People's Assembly or the Shura Council. So there is a serious questioning, and unlike 2005, a serious questioning of whether participation is the best strategy for the opposition, because the opposition continues to face the dominance of the NDP and its tight grip over the legislative process in the two chambers of parliament, and its tight grip over Egyptian politics in general. Third difference, which I would like to highlight, and Michel mentioned it, but I would like to look at it in a detailed manner because it's really related not only to the mechanics but to the politics of the elections as well, which is the issue of judicial supervision. And as Michel rightly mentioned, judicial supervision was removed in 2007 due to the amendment of Article 88 of the Egyptian Constitution, and in place of full judicial supervision on the election day in every polling center. In place of that, there was a law which was amended, in fact, in 2008 to create the Higher Electoral Commission. And this Higher Electoral Commission, if you look at its composition, there are some real concerns which not only Egyptian civil society has, but observers of Egypt has, because the composition of the Higher Electoral Commission, to a great extent, is influenced by the government, by the president, and does not have the neutrality which Electoral Commission should have. At least party neutrality. You cannot see a commission where judges are appointed by the President of the Republic, and the President of the Republic himself is the President of one of the contesting actors of the NDP. President Mubarak is the President of the National Democratic Party. And even at a more of a structural level, and this is really, these are the details which we will have to see on the 28th of November, the Higher Electoral Commission supervises the elections using two arms. And the two arms are a set of general committees where membership is primarily assigned to judges or members of judicial bodies, and the subcommittees where membership is not assigned to judges but to civil servants. And the subcommittees are the committees which are going to manage the details of the election. Those are the committees which are going to be present in the polling centers. Those are the committees which are going to let observers in or do not let them in. And here membership is not assigned to judges but to civil servants. And of course, you know, most of you or some of you in attendance will know that there is one of the structuring realities of Egyptian politics is the penetration of the NDP with regard to different state institutions, and the NDP and the government influence over civil servants, over state institutions. And here we are looking at a structural issue which really raises a great deal of concerns about the neutrality of the Election Commission and its two arms, the general committees and the subcommittees. Now let me move from these 3 points, which to my mind are in a substantial sense different when we compare 2010 to 2005. Let me move to the details of who is contesting the elections. Let me first of all give you some numbers, up-to-date numbers with regard to total number of candidates and so on and so forth. As of early today, at my end, we have over 5,000 candidates who are going to contest, as Michel rightly mentioned, 508 seats of the People's Assembly, 64 assigned to female candidates, assigned to the female quota. Female candidates are 379. We have among the 5,000 candidates, we have candidates affiliated to political parties. Their total number is 1,223, 24 different reports, and the rest are independent candidates. So one of the issues which we have to keep in mind is, in spite of the fact that the government announced in 2005, the NDP, the ruling National Democratic Party, announced in 2005 its interest, its intent to limit the phenomenon of independence, to promote political parties. Because the NDP, as Michel and I wrote in a recent article, because the NDP did not manage to change the electoral system from an individual candidate-based system to a party list-based system, we still have independents dominating the electoral scene. It's over a two-thirds majority of the candidates registered, over 4,000, are independent candidates. Secondly, let's start looking at the different actors, political parties or movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood, which are going to contest the elections, and a bit of a detailed treatment of what kind of issues they are facing and what kind of platforms have they put forward, if any, because some are yet to announce their platforms up until now. Let me start with the secular opposition parties. And here, basically, we are looking at three actors. We are looking at the liberal Wafd party, at the leftist unionist Tajammu party, and at Al-Ghad party, the so-called Musa wing. As some of you know, Al-Ghad was divided into two wings. The Ayman Noor wing decided to boycott the elections, and the Musa wing, which was represented in the People's Assembly 2005-2010, decided to contest the elections. Now, Al-Wafd is running 207 or 208 candidates. Al-Tajammu, the leftist unionist party, is running 78 candidates, and Al-Ghad Musa wing is running 32 candidates. First of all of their candidates who applied for registrations got their registrations. So none of them was disqualified. Not a single candidate from Al-Wafd, not a single candidate from Al-Tajammu or from Al-Ghad Musa wing. Secondly, these figures, in fact, indicate that secular parties, legal parties, are contesting the elections in a more intensive way as compared to 2005. Al-Wafd did not run 208 in 2005, much less, and the same applies to the leftist unionist party as well as Al-Ghad. And the expectation in Egypt, and I just came back from Egypt, I was the last 3 weeks in Egypt and just came back, the expectation is that maybe what we are going to see is a shift within the opposition representation from what we had in 2005, between 2005 and 2010, 20% Muslim Brotherhood and 2% legal political parties, that we are going to see a shift of that, political parties being better represented and the Brotherhood's representation being contained. Now, Two final points with regard to legal secular political parties. Both Al-Wafd and Al-Tajammu decided to participate after requesting and asking, be it their leadership, the General Secretariat, to vote on boycott or participation, in the case of Tajammu, or the General Assembly of the party to vote on boycott or participation, in the case of Al-Wafd. What is striking is that in the two parties, the vote for participation was an extremely narrow vote. In Al-Wafd, it was 54 for participation and 46 for boycott. Al-Tajammu, if I'm not mistaken, 4 members of the General Secretariat, almost 1/3 of the General Secretariat, pushed for boycott. So once again, these parties which decided to participate did not escape completely the controversy which is going on in Egypt about whether it makes sense to continue to participate in that closed polity which has not been democratizing over time. Final point with regard to secular party is that they are running in a positive step. They are running female candidates, of course, because of the female quota, but they are running more female candidates as opposed to 2005. Among the 207 or 208 candidates of Al-Wafd, we have over 30 female candidates. Al-Tajammu is running around 20 female candidates. And these numbers and figures are significant, and to my mind, they show that the female quota has a positive impact, regardless of the result of the elections. At least that party are now more willing to run female candidates is a positive step. From secular parties, from secular opposition parties to the religious-based opposition movement, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. And Michel mentioned different relevant points with regard to the Brotherhood. Let me highlight four issues. First of all, the Brotherhood is running less candidates as compared to 2005. In 2010, they tried to register 134-35. 1/4 was disqualified. We are looking as of now, and the scene is changing, as Michelle mentioned, because they are contesting, the Brotherhood is contesting some of the decisions of the HEC, of the Higher Electoral Commission. But as of now, we have 104 or 105 registered candidates for the Brotherhood. But here they are running, they intended to run 135 to contest 508 seats. In 2005, they ran 150 to contest 444 seats. In 2005, they were keen on contesting 1/3 of the seats of the People's Assembly. This time, they are not interested in contesting more than 20% of the seats of the People's Assembly, and if they end up having around 100 registered candidates, it's going to be exactly around 20%, a bit less or a bit more. So the first issue to keep in mind is that the Brotherhood seems to be weakened or seems to have difficulties and seems not to be able to run and contest the elections at a level similar to what they did in 2005. Second issue is that the Brotherhood, just like, can you still see me, Michelle?
Yes.
The second issue with regard to the Brotherhood is that similar to Al-Wafd and Al-Tajammu', they had their own internal discussion about boycotting the elections or participating in the elections. But within the Brotherhood, this was a big crisis and a big fuss to the Brotherhood in the Egyptian public opinion. The Brotherhood, the movement leadership, the guidance office, requested the opinion of the members of the movement's Shura Council. The result which was announced, whether to boycott or participate, the result which was announced was 98%, sweeping victory for participation. And this result was announced by Assam Al-Aryan, who is the spokesperson of the guidance office of the movement. It was announced only to be refuted a couple of hours later by leading figures within the guidance office who said that it was 53% for participation and the rest of it for boycott, which gives you a picture of a movement which is really and truly divided. But this was not the only sign for divisions. There were two additional signs which are even more significant. Number one is the formation of an opposition front within the Brotherhood, centered around two leading figures of the Brotherhood, forming an opposition front and calling on the movement to boycott the elections and calling on the movement to reform itself before it continues to participate in Egyptian politics. And the second sign was that 22 current MPs, current members of parliament of the Brotherhood, decided not to run in the elections of 2010. We have almost 1/3 of the current 88 MPs of the Brotherhood. I mean, the movement had between 2005 and 2010, 88 seats in the People's Assembly. Among the 88 MPs, 22 decided not to run. The movement tried to nominate, they refused to run in the elections, and 2 of them went out of their way to state in public that they are not running because participation is not paying off. What I'm trying to say is, unlike 2005, where the Muslim Brotherhood was strategically committed to participation, did not doubt the value of participation in Egyptian politics, this time we are looking at a divided movement where significantly and increasingly voices from within are questioning whether participation is the right way to go forward. Final point with regard to the Brotherhood is that the movement is running a high risk by sticking to its slogan, Islam is the solution. As Michelle mentioned, it's running legally a high risk, and members and supporters, candidates are being disqualified and supporters are being arrested because the constitutional change in 2007 provided for banning the use of religious slogans, symbols in political activities, and the change in the law in 2008, Law 38, number 38 in 2008, which created the Higher Electoral Commission, provided and stipulated for banning any use of religious symbols and religious slogans in election campaigns. The movement, however, announced its platform titled Islam is the Solution, continues to try to put the slogan forward in its election campaigns, and is in that way, in fact, giving giving observers in Egypt more than one good reason to doubt whether the movement accepts the binding constitution and legal framework, regardless of whether they see it as biased or not biased, whether they accept it or they are really trying to undermine it. So here we are looking at a move at a brotherhood which is weakened, which is contesting in a way less intensive the elections as they did in 2005, and the expectation, and Michelle and I wrote that recently in a Carnegie commentary, is that the movement will win definitely much less than the 88 seats it ended up getting in 2005. Expectation within the movement is maybe anywhere between 15 and 20. Some observers expect the movement to win up to 25. But we are really looking at a movement whose participation will be cut down drastically. The final actor, which is as interesting as the Brotherhood with regard to its internal dynamics, contesting the elections, is of course the ruling National Democratic Party. And here, with regard to the ruling National Democratic Party, the first striking issue is that the party is running not 508 candidates, a candidate for each seat, contested seats, but the party is running around 800 candidates. And those are not the NDP independents or the NDP disqualified within the internal selection process, members who then try to register themselves as independent candidates. Those are the party candidates, 800. So almost 40% more than what they should have put forward, a candidate for each seat. And this gives you a sense of the fact that the NDP, in spite of the process of modernization which Gamal Mubarak and his group initiated, in spite of creating a selection process based on primaries and based on public opinion polls and based on the leadership's decision at the very end, in spite of all this modernization process which has been going on, the party remains a divided place, a party where each member would like to run, sees running for the parliamentary election, in the parliamentary election for a People's Assembly seat as a major reward they can get from being affiliated with the NDP. Secondly, the NDP, unlike, and here from that negative appearance of running 800 candidates, and of course we still have NDP independent candidates who registered as independents and are going to contest the elections around 145. So a total of 1,000 NDP candidates running in the elections for 508 seats. Besides that negative appearance, one of the positive aspects to highlight with regard to the NDP is the platform which they put forward. It's the most detailed, in fact, the only platform which is focused on public policies, which has a clear timeline, what the NDP government, in case of winning the election, will be implementing in the next 5 years. And when you compare the NDP platform to platforms which were announced by the Brotherhood in Egypt or by the Wafd Liberal Party, you see a different level of detailing, a different level of ability to tackle public policy issues. Of course, this is a government in action. The privilege which the NDP has is it has been ruling for such a long time. Opposition parties do not know how to frame a public policy-based platform. Finally, with regard to the NDP, positively enough, is running 69 female candidates. So 64 female candidates for the quota, for the female quota seats, and add to that, if I'm not mistaken, 3 candidates where more than one female NDP member is running for one of the quota seats, and 2 additional female candidates for the 444 seats accessible for men and women. So here, when you compare that to how many female candidates the NDP nominated in 2005, I guess here we are looking at 200% increase with regard to the women candidacy, female candidacy. Let me close.
Can you try to finish up, Amar?
Yeah.
Are you going to try to finish up in just a few minutes?
Yes, I'm finishing up. No, I'm finishing up in 2 sentences.
Good.
Right. So the first sentence, Jennifer, is. So I am working on a Eid day. No. The first sentence is, beside these actors parties and movements contesting the elections, we have to look at, as Michel mentioned, at two additional groups in Egypt. The first set of, or the first group is the domestic observers. And the big question here, and as Michel rightly mentioned, we have 10,000, over 10,000 who applied for accreditation from the HEC. The big question is whether they will be accredited or not, and this will happen in the next days, but first signs indicate a highly restrictive approach of the HEC, trying to limit access of the observers to polling centers as much as they can. The second, and here's the final sentence, is media coverage. Egypt, unlike 2005, or even more than 2005, I'm sorry, we are looking at a highly diverse and pluralist media scene. State-owned, government-owned, public stations, newspapers, private channels, private newspapers, independent newspapers, and so on and so forth. However, in spite of the plurality and diversity of the media landscape, the first two reports which were put out by Egyptian NGOs following media reporting of the elections indicated a clear bias in favor of the NDP and its candidates, not only on state-owned channels, but even on private channels, to the extent that the Wafd party threatened to boycott the elections if this practice, this bias, will not be ended. So we have to keep an eye as well with regard to the politics of the elections on what will happen to domestic observers, since the government said a clear no to international observation, and what will happen with regard to the media coverage until the 27th, one day before the elections, media campaigns will stop. And so here we will get a good picture of whether this bias will continue to dominate or whether the picture will change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amr. I just want to get to a lot of discussion because I know that there's a lot more to talk about. Well, I have to say that since I first went to Egypt in 1985, I guess I'm not really overwhelmed by all the positive changes other than the media. I noticed we were comparing it back to 2005, but I mean, what I'm hearing as a prediction is that the government will be able to say that there was a lot of electoral competition within parties, and that would be a sign of positive change. I mean, I can see already that's the argument, despite the fact that the judiciary's role, independent judiciary's role, is restricted, and despite the fact that there's been more restrictions on the Muslim Brotherhood. But one of the things that I guess I thought was interesting in your comparison of 2005 and today is, of course, when we look at the last administration's policy, the best parts, the parts in terms of pressure on Egypt, happened right up to those elections. And then actually the showing of the Muslim Brotherhood, along with a number of other events and elections in the region, including the election of Hamas, led to sort of a stepping back. I see these elections as very much a test of sort of the new approach that was taken by the Obama administration. They've said from the beginning that they were going to show results in terms of this new policy of engagement. But even the statement that Michelle appropriately pointed out, a strong statement, it came after Secretary Clinton met with a high-ranking Egyptian and said absolutely nothing. And it came during a continuous set of statements by the ambassador on the ground, which indicated that, in fact, of course, she had no doubts that there was going to be free and fair elections. I mean, so these are mixed messages. And the question is, now, if these elections happen as we expect them, which is limited domestic observation, no international observation, obviously an atmosphere of restrictions in terms of who's going to run, you get a few more people elected and sort of more plurality. What's the U.S. response? This can't be seen as a big positive dividend. So, I mean, that's one of the things I think, running up into 11 months from now, What should the Obama administration do other than making this one statement after the election, and what would be most effective to do?
Shall I take on that easy one? Okay. Okay, well, I quite agree with you, Jennifer, about the inconsistency of the message that's come from the Obama administration on these issues. It's also, you know, I think it's a different situation in Egypt now with the presidential succession looming in a way now that it wasn't quite in 2005. I think that tensions are a little higher in the resistance or the stubbornness, you know, of the Egyptian ruling group, you know, to pressure from outside is higher than it was 5 years ago. I also think, unfortunately, because of the inconsistency in the way that the U.S. has pursued this issue, that in a way we've taught the Egyptian government that they can afford to ignore us, and that after a time we'll go away for one reason or another, you know. And so that's, you know, that's kind of unfortunate, but I do think that's part of the picture now. So what does that mean? What does that mean the U.S. should do? I mean, I personally think that the U.S. has to take a more strategic approach to this. Of course, I think we have to be more consistent and more persistent and more patient, and not give up easily on these issues. I also think that the U.S. government needs to look a little bit more at the U.S.-Egyptian relationship and start figuring out where are the incentives and disincentives that can be created. You know, the U.S., as I've said many times, the U.S. is an outside actor. We're not going to just make things happen in Egypt. That isn't realistic, and that isn't going to happen. But it's a question of the U.S. playing whatever role it can play, because otherwise, if the U.S. doesn't play any role at all, it's seen very much as just bolstering the government in whatever it wants to do. And as I said at the end of my presentation, I think it's important that the U.S. try to pursue these issues with seriousness now, before a leadership succession takes place, and not to wait until that point. In order to partly to kind of pave the way and build an understanding about where the United States hopes that Egypt will move over the next several years.
Amr, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I'm fine. I agree with what Michelle just said.
So let me just push a little bit more on the domestic observation question, just to ask, of the domestic observation that observers that are seeking to be registered, how many are affiliated with the parties themselves? How many are affiliated with civil society groups? Can we have some sense of, and because one of the other key issues is how Egyptian civil society has actually matured or become more effective, and how is that manifesting itself in these elections? If you could comment on that, Amr, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. That's a very good point and a good question. I'm afraid I do not, and Michelle, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, or to add to what I'm going to say. Jennifer, up until now, we know that we have over 10,000 independent observers affiliated to different non-governmental organizations, domestic organizations. Some of them are organized in alliances. We have, for example, the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights leading an alliance of over 70 NGOs, fielding over 2,000, trying to register over 2,000 observers, trying to get licenses for them. And we have similar alliances and other independent organizations attempting to get licenses for their observers. And this is the big chunk of observers domestically whom we are looking at, and they are independent. And then we have party-affiliated observers. I'm not sure about numbers, be it with regard to the NDP or with regard to any opposition party or movement. But I have been reading reports in Egypt indicating that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Wafd are going to depend primarily on NGOs to observe the elections for them. One of the methods which domestic observers used in 2005 to forego the restrictions imposed on them by the authorities, not licensing them, is to go to the individual candidate and get a license from him or her to observe the elections on his behalf or on her behalf, which is legally possible. So one of the methods which were implemented by observers, domestic observers in 2005, was to go to individual candidates and get authorization from them to observe the elections on their behalf. And based on recent reports which I've been reading, both the Brotherhood and the Wafd are going to depend on that modality to ensure the presence of some observers on their behalf in the polling centers. However, all of that makes only sense if the subcommittees, once again, the structure of the HEC, general committees and subcommittees, all of that makes sense if the subcommittees are going to let them in. And the subcommittees are going to be highly influenced by the Ministry of the Interior, by the NDP, by governmental wishes. So this cannot be judged before the 28th, I'm afraid.
If I could just add something, Jennifer, to Amar's points on this. Certainly there's a much larger civil society monitoring effort this year. I think in total in 2005 there were around 5,000 people trained to monitor the elections. And because the elections were held on 3 different days, you could use the same people on different days. A much larger effort was needed this year because of, as I said, 50,000 polling stations on one day. And if you want to, they're still not going to be able to cover all of them. Or even, but even to cover a significant number of them, you need a lot more people. We're being conservative in saying 10,000. We had an event here a few weeks ago at which Mahmoud Ali, who's the head of one of the NGOs that's been doing monitoring, spoke. He said that 14,000 are being trained altogether. And the National Human Rights Commission just announced that 7,000 observers have come to it to get credentials. It's a little bit confusing, but a monitor can go either to the National Human Rights Commission or the Higher Electoral Commission as a first step to get credentials. Ultimately, the Electoral Commission, I think, has to approve everybody. But so at least 7,000 chose to go to the National Human Rights Council. I haven't heard how many have gone, maybe that many again, have gone directly to the Higher Electoral Commission. So it's a much bigger effort. And this is an effort that has not been completely dropped in the last 5 years. These civil society organizations have been trying, not very successfully, to monitor elections that have taken place in between, like the Shura Council and the local council elections. And they've been sort of using those as training and practice and so forth. And part of what I'm saying about the concerns about people getting credentials and getting them on time are based on the bad experiences that they had in those other elections with this very same Higher Electoral Commission. So also your question about whether these are people affiliated to parties, no, I mean, those are separate. The candidates' own representatives are a separate body of people. But the ones that I'm talking about do come from civil society organizations. And interestingly, the regulations that the Higher Electoral Commission has put out for credentialing civil society monitors say specifically that you can't belong to a political party or be affiliated with any political party or candidate if you want to get credentialed as a civil society monitor.
Great. Let me open it up. Yes, right here in front.
Yeah, I want to ask.
Can you identify yourself, please?
My name is Abdul Wahab Hassan.
Just have them wait for the microphone.
American Organization for Change. American Egyptian.
I'm sorry, could you speak into the microphone? Otherwise, we don't pick you up on the tape.
Yeah, my name is Abdul Wahab Hassan, and I'm with the American Egyptian Coalition for Change. And my question is, how do you see the popularity of the Brotherhood on the ground? And do you see that really the Egyptian people are have a real reaction with the election, or most of them are just busy with their ordinary life?
Do we want to collect a couple of questions? Yes. Back, all the way back. Do we only have one? Oh, here we go.
Thank you very much. My name is Mu'taz Zahran from the Egyptian Embassy. And I just wanted to say that this is a very interesting debate. It actually shows how new grounds have been broken in Egyptian political life. But one thing that I wanted to draw attention to, there were comparisons on 2005 and today. And one of the things that I think panelists have missed out was the emergency law itself, the emergency law that has been in place in 2005. Today, it has been by law seriously restricted and confined to cases of terrorism and counter-narcotics. So the argument before that elections under emergency law application were not real elections, I think this time needs a little reflection also on your part. One other thing is the High Elections Commission. I hear throughout the panel's words that it is somewhat less independent. I'm a bit surprised here. The commission is not presided by ministers of interior or political participation. It's a commission that is presided by judges and the judiciary in Egypt. And Amra, please correct me if I'm wrong, is still considered by the overwhelming majority of the populace as the real guarantor of civil liberties in Egypt. And again, the same question would apply to the monitors when we say they are limited. I think Jennifer has mentioned limited local monitoring of the elections, and I'm just wondering here where limited has come from, whereas 10,000 have already applied, and we are yet to see their actual monitoring and participation. Thank you very much.
One other question. We had somebody over here. Yeah, right here in front.
Marina Ottawa with the Carnegie Endowment. Amra, you indicated at the beginning that the Egyptian government is concerned about not projecting a negative image in these elections. Then you proceeded to make a presentation that somehow did not quite support that statement. So what I'd like you to ask to elaborate, where you see this concern by the Egyptian government?
Great. Why don't we start with those three? I don't know who wants to start. Amr, do you want to start?
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much. Let me start by Abdul Wahab's question on the Muslim Brotherhood. And I mean, we do not know much about its popularity, but we know that the movement is weakened and is divided as compared to 2005. And the weakened and divided movement weakened not only due to its internal divisions, but weakened because it has been facing a cycle of repression since its good showing in the elections of 2005. Leaders of the movement were put on military tribunals. It has been facing different repressive measures. As I said, 1/4 of its candidates for the upcoming elections were disqualified, and so on and so forth. The movement is weakened and divided, and I guess its performance will not be up to what we saw in 2005. It's an expectation, and this expectation is, to an extent, at least supported by what happened in the last Shura Council elections and the last local elections, where the movement basically did not win a single seat with regard to the Shura Council, and was forced to boycott the local council's elections because the majority of its candidates were not registered. So I guess we are going to see a mix of a weakened and divided movement and a government policy to limit and contain its representation in the Egyptian People's Assembly. With regard to the Higher Electoral Commission, Mu'taz, and I completely agree. Judges and the judiciary is looked at in Egypt as ultimately the guarantor of civil liberties and so on and so forth. But the HEC is not composed only of judges. We have two groups within the HEC. We have a group of judges, 4 judges, the president, the chairman of the HEC, the vice chairman, and 2 additional judges, which get to the HEC by virtue of their judicial positions. Cassation Court of Cairo, Alexandria, and so on and so forth. This is the first component of the HEC. The HEC has a second component, which is 7 members selected by the People's Assembly and by the Shura Council, based, of course, on majority-minority relations within the People's Assembly and the Shura Council. And the 7, 4 of them are or have to be former members of judicial bodies, and 3 of them have to be former members of judicial bodies, and 4 of them independent figures. And where the concerns of Egyptian civil society and observers of Egyptian politics come is when you look at this second group, which is clearly selected based on a big influence of the NDP. The NDP has a clear majority in the People's Assembly and in the Shura Council. And the concern is when we compare this composition to full judicial supervision of the elections, which we had up until 2005, some concerns emerge with regard to neutrality. And add to that, unfortunately, Mu'taz, is that the higher electoral commission has not performed in a neutral manner with regard to the last Shura Council elections and the last local council elections. So we have negative precedents, unfortunately, in the last couple of years. Marina's question on the government being concerned, they are not doing much. They are not doing much to make the elections, the parliamentary elections, appear to make the elections do not acquire the same bad reputation the 2005 elections acquired. They are, to my mind, focusing on 3 strategies, which are not very effective, neither in the domestic scene nor in the international scene. But these strategies, Marina, give you an idea of why they are concerned and how they are trying to manage the scene. They are put forward, in fact, in a very systematic manner, a public rhetoric defending the neutrality of the HEC. Mu'taz gave us an example of that. If you look at Egyptian newspapers, state-owned, government or NDP closed newspapers, this is what you read every day. The HEC is independent and it manages and supervises the elections, and no one interferes in that. Secondly, they have been trying to suggest to the international community, we are not letting international observers in because this represents a violation of Egyptian sovereignty, of national sovereignty. And they have been building and capitalizing on that even in the statement, in the hard statement which came out a few hours ago. This is exactly what's being said. We do not wish to see any intervention or any violations of Egyptian national sovereignty. And thirdly, they have been trying to through accrediting domestic observers and signaling their intent of accrediting them to say that, well, the elections are going to be observed well domestically. However, these 3 strategies will work out or will not work out on the election day and a bit prior to the election day when we have the exact numbers of how many domestic observers are registered, how many are going to be in the polling centers, and when we get the details of whether the Ministry of the Interior and the subcommittees will let them in or not.
Yeah, just to respond to a couple of those points, Mu'taz, your point on the emergency law. Look, I think that the fact is that the emergency law was renewed, despite President Mubarak's promises to lift it and to put in place a more specific counterterrorism law. It's true that when it was renewed in May of this year, the Egyptian government said it's only going to be used in cases of counterterrorism and narcotics, but actually they have said that kind of thing before, and we will see. The point is the fact that it was renewed, I think, was a signal. That we the Egyptian government still keep to ourselves all the powers under the emergency law, and we might choose not to use them, or then at other times we might choose to use them. And so, that state of affairs still remains. Regarding 2 things that you said about the Higher Electoral Commission, and why are we saying that it's not independent, and why are we saying that the role of monitors, civilian, domestic Egyptian monitors, is likely to be very limited? As Amr indicated, I mean, this is based on past behavior. We're not making this stuff up. I mean, this is based on what has been happening. You can look at the composition of the commission, of the Higher Electoral Commission, and say, in theory, it might be independent. I mean, you're quite right. It doesn't have the Minister of Interior on it or anything. But at the same time, you look at the behavior of the commission up till now, and it doesn't look very independent. I mean, Amr mentioned the disqualifying almost all the opposition candidates for the Shura Council and for the local council elections in the last couple of years. And then look what we've seen happened now. I mean, Amr just read you the numbers. So you had you see statements coming out from the ruling party saying, we have a feeling not very many Muslim brothers are going to win this year. That, we're not going to see a Muslim Brotherhood presence that like we saw in 2005. And then what happens in the commission? You see, over 300 members of secular opposition parties successfully register their candidacies without any problems. And then you see 1/4 of the 134 Muslim Brotherhood candidates not be able to register. Now, are Muslim brothers, especially bad at filling out paperwork? I don't think that's the issue here. And so it really calls into doubt the neutrality and the independence of the Electoral Commission if you see them basically through bureaucratic and regulation type of ways carrying out a political agenda that's already been announced by the ruling party. And again with monitors, we'll wait and see. I certainly hope that those 10,000 or 14,000 or however many are applying for accreditation get accredited and get access to the polls. That would certainly give a much better image to the Electoral Commission. But what we saw in the last couple of elections, notably the June Shura Council elections this year, was not promising.
Well, I just want to add 2 points. One is when I was in Cairo last March, and met with a number of individuals, both from within the government and in the parliament. The issue of they were working on a draft of an anti-terrorism law, and the issue at that point was to try to make in an anti-terrorism law the powers to be as specific as possible so that the restrictions were as specific as possible, allowing maximum opportunity for civil liberties. And so I think it the emergency law by its very definition is so broad brush that, and it's been used in such a way, so, it doesn't really help that, you've said you're going to restrict it. When in fact, so why didn't that anti-terrorism law move forward in any kind of specific way, and to give the people assurance that in fact that it wasn't to be used in a broad sense. The other thing I want to say about observation, I think it's worth noting, the logistics of actually trying to mount an observation effort in a country as large as Egypt are huge. And you're now talking 10 days in, and if you're a group, no matter how capable you are, how can you possibly get everything organized, even if you got people got accredited today? If you got everything organized to deploy that many people, it's almost impossible. So every day that gets closer and there's no accreditation means that basically limits the ability of domestic observers to do their job, which if we're saying anyway is going to be quite significant. So anyway, let me come up here. I know there was a couple of other questions here, and yes.
Thank you. For the reason Jennifer, Michelle, and Amr mentioned, the Egyptian Americans and Egyptians in this area are planning a demonstration in front of the Egyptian embassy this coming Saturday at 1 o'clock for protesting all the signals and the appearances of unfair and unreal elections coming up on the 28th. My question basically to Amr, it is sad to see the Muslim Brotherhood so divided, Al-Ghad so divided, even the NDP is divided. How could you explain that? At a time we have such an autocratic regime, and instead of getting united with each other, they are divided among themselves. It puzzles me.
Okay. And there was somebody here, yes?
Nabil Khouri, U.S. State Department. Look, Michelle and Amr point out, along with reformers in the region and in the U.S., all the restrictions and limitations that exist on freedom of participation in Egypt. In return, the government, the authorities, reply, this is not true, it's a fair and free election, we've made improvements. This, of course, is a disingenuous argument. It's a diplomatic, self-serving argument. But the real argument used by the authorities is that, of course, we manipulate the elections, and we have to, because there is extremism, because there are social and political forces that would be at each other's throat, et cetera, et cetera. So the real position is, yes, we manipulate knowingly, and we know what we're doing. So what is your position on that philosophical argument? What is your theory of social change here? Should the Egyptian government throw out all these restrictions and have a completely fair and free election, no matter what the result? Or is the logic that there are fears here? Is that a logical position for them to take?
So, Amr and Michelle, I would just note that, again, I was in Egypt in 1985, just when Mubarak was coming to power, and there were some hopes that it would be. And it's the same argument back then. So it's like nothing has changed in terms of the fears. So it's not like this is a new position that the Egyptian government has taken after September 11th or something. So, but anyway, Michelle.
Okay, so to your question, Nabil. Look, I think that there's a question here about what it is really that fosters extremism in a country like Egypt, or fosters disunity, fosters violence within the society, and so forth. Is it, are those forces just there and the government is trying to manage them the best it is, or does the existence of authoritarian government and the lack of opportunities for people to express themselves and to organize themselves in a peaceful way, does that actually foster violence and the growth of extremism and so forth? So that's a very big theoretical argument. But to bring it more down to earth, so you asked the question, should the government of Egypt throw out all the restrictions and just, open the floodgates, have a free and fair election, and so forth? Look, I don't think that anyone is trying to, push the Egyptian government into a very radical and a very radical political opening and basically tossing the entire political system out the window and starting with something entirely new and so forth. And I agree the results of that would be unpredictable. But if you look at the kinds of things, for example, the 7-point agenda of the National Association for Change of Mohammed al-Baradei that has gotten something now close to 1 million signatures in Egypt. Or if you look at the kind of things that I just listed that were in the State Department statement, these are sort of gradual measures, that have been that people are asking for. I mean, there's an agenda that arises out of civil society and opposition in Egypt, and you hear that echoed in what the U.S. and others are pushing for, and it's fairly modest. I mean, what were we looking at in this election? We're talking about domestic monitoring, international observers, allowing people to campaign, allowing opposition candidates. We already heard that the Muslim Brotherhood was only trying to register 134 candidates. They were only trying to run for a quarter of the seats of parliament. The Muslim Brotherhood has also announced that in the presidential election next year, even if it became much easier for an independent non-party group to get a candidate on the ballot, they wouldn't even try to put a candidate on the ballot. Okay, so this sort of bugaboo that we can't let up at all because the Muslim Brotherhood will come sweeping through, I think is really just it's not it's a theory. I mean, under present circumstances and under the present kind of reforms that are being looked for, it's not something that is a realistic scenario. And just briefly on why are all the political groups so divided, Hussein, I know that question's primarily for Amr, and I'm going to let him answer it. But what I wanted to say about it is one of the things that I see happening with this whole debate, participate, boycott, and so forth, is there's a real question arising, within Egyptian society about how legitimate is this political system, and, what's the way to bring about change? 5 years ago, people thought, well, okay, let's try to use the existing system and see if we can press for change within the existing system. We're now seeing, all the opposition groups and significant either majorities or significant minorities inside all the opposition groups starting to say, that just hasn't worked, and starting to be more receptive to what Mohammed al-Baradei and others are saying about, what, we have to just challenge this and say this whole system is illegitimate, we won't participate in it, we have to push for something completely different, and that's unfortunately, the results, I think, of a failure to bring about any meaningful political reforms, however, gradually and so forth they could have been implemented, but it just hasn't happened.
Amr, last words?
Well, let me combine Nabil's and Hussein's question, and basically say the following to the issue of what if the Egyptian government decided to open up the system to have free and fair elections? What will happen on the next day? What about the day after? Are we going to see a Muslim Brotherhood dominated government? And what kind of impacts is this going to have on Egypt society? And on Egypt's polity. And mind you, of course, all of us know that we are looking at a country with growing sectarian tensions. This is not the Egypt of the 1980s or 1970s or 1990s. This is a much, much worse situation we are looking at. And we are not looking at a country which is doing and undertaking its first steps in terms of opening up the political system. We are looking at a sort of semi-authoritarian setting since the second half of the 1970s. So what will happen on the next day? And let me, Nabil, basically say that to counter argue what the government has been saying, that we rig or manipulate the elections and we do it knowingly. Let me put forward four very brief points, and this is not my creativity or imagination. This is what Egyptian civil society has been putting forward as well. Number one is, and as Michel rightly said, this is not about replacing the current ruling establishment with a new one. This is not about getting al-Ikhwan in place of the current ruling establishment. This is not about getting al-Ikhwan or any set of opposition actors to control the system. This is about dropping off some of the restrictions and limitations which we have been having since the second half of the 1970s, and which has led to an extremely distorted polity in Egypt. Hussein's question on the divisions, internal divisions between Egyptian opposition forces, this is not only related to what Michel mentioned about the reality of facing tough choices in a restricted environment and not knowing really whether to participate or to boycott and questioning the legitimacy of the system. This is related to an extent at least to the fact that the semi-authoritarian setting keeps facing opposition actors, parties and movements with challenges which create divisions, which create different choices, and which this is the logic of semi-authoritarianism. It faces opposition actors, movements and parties with greater challenges as opposed to the ruling establishment itself. So, but we are not saying replace the ruling establishment. We are not saying that fair and free elections will mean that a movement like the Muslim Brotherhood will have a strategic majority or commands a strategic majority out there in the Egyptian citizenry. This is not what we know from public opinion polls. Thirdly, the movement itself, and this is sort of the biggest threat coming from the opposition spectrum, is the Muslim Brotherhood threat. As Michel rightly mentioned, the movement is not into participation to dominate, is not into getting in to dominate. I mean, the slogan, one of the famous slogans of the movement is participation and no domination, musharaka lal mughalaba. And the fact that it's running only 1/4 is a good indication. Even in 2005, only 1/3. Not getting close to having even a minority which can boycott the domination of the NDP over the legislative process. So here we are looking at modest opposition movements. All what they are trying to get is to have a sustainable representation in parliament and to contest to an extent free and fair elections. A final point which is being put forward by civil society, fine. you are employing the restrictions which we have been seeing. The government is employing the restrictions which we have outlined on different opposition actors, primarily the Brotherhood. So what about domestic observation? Why are you limiting the access of domestic observation? Why are you limiting or delaying the accreditation of them up until the very last day before the elections? Here, the details of the management of the election scene does not indicate a reform-oriented government. Even if it is fearing of what will happen, it can do much, much better. It can do a bit more than what we have been seeing. Taking the fear into consideration, knowing about what might happen, even within these parameters, they can do a bit more. They can ease restrictions to an extent. So this is really what needs and what is being put forward. And if it's going to continue to be as we are seeing it today, I'm afraid that the legitimacy of the system is going to be challenged at an even greater intensity. El-Baradei's attempt was the first attempt in the last 5 years to fundamentally challenge the legitimacy of the system. And this is going to happen again if reform will not take place in a substantial, in gradual but substantial manner.
Well, thank you very much. I think perhaps we speak for everybody that I hope that the Egyptian government proves us all wrong here today. I hope that they take bold steps to prove that they are not feeling like they're just a couple of years in power and it's an unstable situation, and that they really have to be careful. And, you know, this is a system that is waiting for some bold and some important political steps by the Egyptian government so that our colleagues here and the Egyptian embassy don't have to come to such things. We will be celebrating all the great steps forward. Meanwhile, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Michelle and Amr for your brilliant insights.